Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The winter of 1894 was particularly brutal in the remote mining town of Colwood, nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. The town itself was unremarkable on maps. A small collection of wooden structures, a church steeple, and the imposing sheriff's office that stood at the only road leading in or out. What happened there over the course of 3 months would remain buried in county records and newspaper archives for decades, mentioned only in hushed tones by those who survived. Colwood had been established in 1872 as a company town after prospectors discovered a rich coal seam running through the mountains. The Appalachian Coal Company constructed the necessary infrastructure with remarkable speed: 50 simple homes for workers, a company store, a small school, and a modest church. The town was positioned in a narrow valley with steep wooded slopes rising on 3 sides and a single dirt road connecting it to the nearest settlement, some 17 miles away. This geographical isolation would later prove crucial to the events that unfolded. The discovery of an even richer coal vein in September 1894 marked a turning point for the previously struggling settlement. According to records from the county assessor's office, the estimated value of the mine increased nearly 3-fold after this discovery. Coincidentally, though as later evidence would reveal, not coincidentally at all, this was precisely when the town's original sheriff, Walter Monroe, was found dead at the bottom of a mine shaft on October 7, 1894. The coroner's report, later scrutinized during investigations in 1958, listed the cause as accidental death, though several inconsistencies were noted even at the time. It began with a simple town meeting on December 3, 1894. Sheriff Jeremiah Blackwood had called the entire population, all 216 residents, to gather at the town hall. According to records later recovered from the county seat in Charleston, Blackwood had been appointed, not elected, following the mysterious death of the previous sheriff just 2 months prior. The town's coal mine had recently struck a particularly profitable vein, and outside investors were showing interest in the previously overlooked settlement. Blackwood himself was not from Colwood or even West Virginia. County employment records indicated he had previously served as security personnel for several mining operations in Pennsylvania. His appointment came through unusual channels, a direct recommendation from the governor's office, bypassing the normal county procedures. This irregularity would only be noticed years later, when historians began piecing together the full narrative. The town meeting that evening was documented in unusual detail thanks to Eliza Peterson, the schoolteacher who habitually kept detailed notes of community gatherings. Her notebook, preserved by her niece and donated to the State Historical Society in 1947, provides a minute-by-minute account of how events began to unfold. Sheriff Blackwood arrived precisely at 7 p.m., she wrote, accompanied by 4 men I had never seen before. They positioned themselves at each corner of the room, which struck me as peculiar given the mundane nature of what we believed would be discussed, namely, the winter road maintenance schedule and provisions for the expected harsh weather. What nobody knew that evening was that Sheriff Blackwood had already made arrangements that would seal the fate of everyone present. As recorded in the minutes of that meeting, discovered decades later during a courthouse renovation in 1962, Blackwood stood before the assembled townspeople and made an announcement that confused many. As of this moment, the town of Colwood is under quarantine by my authority as sheriff. No one leaves until I determine it's safe. According to Peterson's notes, the initial reaction was bewilderment rather than alarm. Jacob Miller, owner of the general store, stood up and asked directly, "Quarantine for what illness, Sheriff?" "We've had no reports of sickness." Blackwood's response, recorded verbatim by Peterson, would later be recognized as the first indication of his true intentions. "The contamination isn't of the body, Mr. Miller. It's of the mind." Outside influences have been detected that threaten the stability and security of Colwood. Until we determine who has been compromised, everyone stays put. Several other residents raised questions, including Dr. Samuel Hayes, who, as the town physician, pointed out that he had seen no unusual symptoms among the population. Blackwood cut these inquiries short by having one of his men fire a shotgun into the ceiling of the town hall, a dramatic gesture that immediately silenced the room. Witnesses later reported confusion rather than panic. There had been no illness reported, no outbreak of any kind. When pressed for explanation, Blackwood simply stated there had been contamination of minds that required his intervention. The vagueness of this statement would become horrifyingly clear in the days to come. The records from that period show a disturbing pattern. Within 48 hours, Blackwood had converted the mine storage facilities into makeshift cells. The townsmen were separated from women and families. Those who protested were the first to be formally imprisoned. As documented in Blackwood's own logbook recovered in 1958, he wrote with clinical detachment, "Resistance expected. Examples made." The first example was William Thornton, a respected miner who had worked in Colwood since its founding. When Blackwood's deputies came to escort Thornton's teenage sons to a separate holding area, he objected. According to witness testimonies collected during the subsequent investigation, Thornton was beaten severely in front of his family and at least 20 neighbors who had been gathered to watch. Blackwood reportedly addressed the assembled crowd afterward. "This is what happens when individual concerns are placed above community safety. Remember this. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the lack of outside intervention. Colwood's isolated position, accessible only by a single mountain road that became impassable during winter storms, meant that communication with the outside world was completely severed when Blackwood cut the telegraph lines on December 4th. In his official records, he documented this act as necessary containment. The town doctor, Samuel Hayes, kept a secret journal during this period. Discovered hidden beneath the floorboards of his office during renovations in 1937, his descriptions provide the most comprehensive account of what happened during those months. "The sheriff has established a system of informants," Hayes wrote on December 9th. "Neighbors reporting on neighbors. Children separated from parents who show signs of resistance. He has them housed in the church now, under guard." Hayes's journal entries became increasingly anxious as December progressed. On December 12th, he wrote, "Margaret Wilson came to me today with bruised wrists and a split lip. She claimed she had fallen, but her eyes told a different story. When I asked if someone had hurt her, she glanced at the deputy stationed outside my office window and whispered, 'Walls have ears, doctor, even yours.'" The psychological tactics employed by Blackwood were sophisticated for a man with no formal training in such matters. As Hayes noted on December 14th, the sheriff has instituted daily community affirmations in the town square. Residents must publicly declare their loyalty and report any suspicious thoughts or behaviors they have witnessed. Those who report others are given extra food rations. I watched Mrs. Parker, who has been neighbors with the Smiths for 15 years, stand and accuse Mr. Smith of harboring resentment against the sheriff's protection. Smith was taken away immediately. By mid-December, according to Hayes's account, nearly half the town was imprisoned in various improvised facilities: the mine storage buildings, the church basement, and cells hastily constructed behind the sheriff's office. Those still technically free were subject to strict curfews and daily loyalty sessions, where they were required to report any suspicious behavior among family members or neighbors. "What appears most disturbing," Hayes wrote on December 18th, "is not the sheriff's actions, but how quickly some townspeople have adapted to become his enforcers. Martin from the general store now carries a deputy's badge and a shotgun. He was always a mild-mannered man before." The transformation of ordinary citizens into willing participants in Blackwood's system was a phenomenon that would later interest psychologists who studied the case. Dr. Eleanor Richards of Columbia University, who published an analysis in the American Journal of Psychology in 1966, noted that the Colwood incident represented a textbook example of how quickly social norms can collapse under authoritarian pressure, particularly in isolated communities where alternative viewpoints are unavailable. The weather that winter was unusually severe. County records from Charleston note that no mail coaches reached Colwood between December 10, 1894, and February 22, 1895. During this period, Blackwood's control over the town became absolute. The mining operation continued, but with workers under armed guard. According to Hayes's journal, the coal extracted was being stockpiled rather than shipped out, a fact that confused many, but which no one dared question openly. The general store's supplies, which would normally have been replenished regularly by wagons from Charleston, began to dwindle. Blackwood instituted rationing, but with clear preferential treatment. His deputies and those who demonstrated loyalty received full portions. Those deemed questionable received progressively less. Hayes documented the physical effects of this policy. "I am seeing cases of malnutrition already, particularly among children whose parents have been imprisoned. When I requested additional food for them, citing medical necessity, the sheriff informed me that hardship builds character and suggested I was, perhaps, too sympathetic to potential subversives. Perhaps most chilling were the trials that began in January. Blackwood presided over makeshift court proceedings in the town hall. According to Hayes, who was forced to attend as a witness, these were nothing more than performances meant to instill fear. Today, Mrs. Ellison was accused of harboring thoughts against the natural order, he wrote on January 7th. Her crime was questioning why her husband remained imprisoned. The sheriff sentenced her to the quiet room, the mine office basement that has been converted for solitary confinement. These trials followed no recognized legal procedure. There were no defense attorneys, no juries of peers, and evidence consisted primarily of testimony from Blackwood's informants. Schoolteacher Peterson, who was permitted to observe several proceedings before she herself was detained, described them as theatrical productions designed to remind us all of the sheriff's absolute power. She noted that Blackwood always wore his full uniform with polished boots and badge prominently displayed, and spoke in formal, almost ceremonial language that mimicked judicial proceedings without adhering to any actual legal standards. From recovered documents and later testimonies, a pattern emerges of Blackwood's methodology. He isolated those who questioned authority first. Then he targeted anyone with influence, the schoolteacher, the minister, prominent business owners. By removing these figures and replacing them with his loyal deputies, he systematically dismantled any potential resistance. Reverend Timothy Walsh, the town's Presbyterian minister, became a particular target after he delivered a sermon on January 10th that Blackwood deemed seditious. According to church members who later testified, the sermon had simply included the biblical passage about rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. Walsh was imprisoned that same evening and held in solitary confinement for 3 weeks. When he emerged, according to Hayes' journal, he was a hollow shell of himself, agreeing publicly with everything the sheriff said and encouraging his congregation to do the same. The sound of boots on wooden porches became the most feared noise in Colwood. Hayes writes about neighbors who would stop mid-conversation at the sound, eyes darting nervously to windows and doors. "We speak in whispers now, even in our own homes," he noted on January 23rd. "The walls of these houses are thin. Sound travels in the cold air." Children proved particularly vulnerable to manipulation. Blackwood established what he called junior deputies, a group of boys aged 10 to 14 who were given special armbands and minor privileges in exchange for reporting on their parents and neighbors. Hayes documented the case of 10-year-old James Wilson, who received extra food rations after reporting that his father had called the sheriff power-hungry in private. The father spent 2 weeks in solitary confinement, emerging with a pronounced stammer that reportedly remained with him for the rest of his life. A particularly disturbing aspect of Blackwood's reign was his use of the town's existing social tensions. According to several accounts, including Hayes's journal and later statements to investigators, Blackwood expertly exploited existing rivalries and suspicions. The Millers and the Taylors, families with a long-standing land dispute, were played against each other. Blackwood would release one Miller from imprisonment, only to arrest two Taylors the next day, creating the impression that information had been exchanged for freedom. Hayes observed this strategy with clinical precision. The sheriff has mapped the town's social dynamics with remarkable accuracy for an outsider. He knows exactly which pressure points to exploit, which old wounds to reopen. The Anderson family, who have always been viewed with some suspicion due to their relative prosperity, were among the first to be elevated to deputy status. This both played on existing resentments and created new ones. By February, conditions had deteriorated severely. Food supplies, typically stocked for winter months, were being controlled and distributed by Blackwood's deputies. Hayes documented cases of malnutrition and illness resulting from the cramped, unsanitary conditions in the improvised prisons. "I am permitted to treat the prisoners once weekly," he wrote on February 10th. "What I see are hollow-eyed specters, not the robust miners and shopkeepers I've known for years." The mining operations continued despite the deteriorating conditions in town. Blackwood seemed particularly focused on maintaining coal production, though, as Hayes noted with confusion, the coal is being stockpiled rather than shipped. Mountains of it now sit near the rail spur, covered with canvas. What purpose this serves, none of us can determine, but questioning leads to immediate punishment. The question that would later confound investigators was simple. Why did no one resist more forcefully? Hayes' journal provides the most compelling theory. "The brilliance of the sheriff's method is in its incrementalism," he wrote. "Each new restriction, each new arrest seems connected to the previous one by some twisted logic. By the time the situation became truly unbearable, we were already divided, weakened, and watched." This observation aligns with what sociologist Robert Mersheimer would later call the frog in boiling water effect in his 1969 analysis of authoritarianism in isolated communities. The Coalwood incident demonstrates how oppression that increases gradually can bypass our natural resistance mechanisms, he wrote. Each small step seems tolerable in isolation, making the cumulative effect harder to resist than a sudden implementation of the same restrictions. There were, of course, attempts at resistance. On January 29th, a small group led by former mine foreman Frank Donovan attempted to overpower the guards at the main improvised prison. The attempt failed when one of the junior deputies discovered their planning meeting and reported it to Blackwood. All 7 conspirators were publicly beaten in the town square and then placed in solitary confinement. According to Hayes, who was called to treat their injuries, none of them spoke a word after that day. Whether from physical trauma or psychological breaking, I cannot say with certainty. A crucial piece of evidence that would later emerge during the 1958 investigation was a letter found in Blackwood's personal effects. Dated November 15, 1894, weeks before the lockdown began. It was from a representative of the Eastern Coal Consortium, a powerful group of industrialists based in Philadelphia. The letter referenced securing complete control of the Coalwood deposit and removing obstacles to acquisition. It promised Blackwood significant compensation for services in preparing the town for transition of ownership. Further correspondence, discovered during the same investigation, revealed a sophisticated plan to use the winter isolation to fundamentally alter ownership of the town and its valuable mine. Blackwood was not merely a corrupt sheriff. He was an agent for corporate interests who had identified Coalwood's isolation as an opportunity for what amounted to a privatized coup d'etat. What Blackwood apparently didn't anticipate was the determination of one young man, Thomas Wiley, the assistant telegraph operator. According to his sworn statement given in April 1895 and preserved in the state archives, Wiley had been repairing lines on the outskirts of town when Blackwood cut the main telegraph connection. Recognizing what was happening, he concealed his knowledge and began working on a plan. Wiley was only 19 years old, described in county employment records as slight of build, but quick-witted. His position as assistant telegraph operator was considered minor enough that Blackwood did not immediately imprison him, instead assigning him to snow-clearing details and other manual labor. This proved to be a critical miscalculation. Over the course of several weeks during his assigned work details clearing snow from the town's paths, Wiley secretly repaired a secondary telegraph line that ran along an abandoned spur of the railroad track. On February 15th, during a particularly heavy snowstorm that kept even Blackwood's deputies indoors, Wiley managed to send a message to the telegraph office in Charleston. In his later testimony, Wiley described crawling through snowdrifts to reach the hidden telegraph key he had assembled from spare parts smuggled from the main office. "The cold was so intense that my fingers kept sticking to the metal key," he recalled. "But I knew it might be the only chance we had." The response was not immediate. The message, as recorded in the Charleston Telegraph Office's log, was initially treated with skepticism. "Request immediate assistance. Stop. Town of Colwood under illegal detention by Sheriff Blackwood. Stop. Approximately 200 citizens imprisoned. Stop." The operator in Charleston noted it as a potential prank or misunderstanding. It wasn't until February 18th, when Wiley managed to send a second, more detailed message, that authorities. This time, he included specific details about prominent Charleston residents who had relatives in Colwood, information that a prankster would be unlikely to know. "My uncle is Judge Frederick Harrington of the Charleston Circuit Court. Stop. His sister Marion is among those detained. Stop, please. Verify my identity with him and send immediate assistance. Stop," Wiley transmitted. This personal connection to a respected judge proved crucial in overcoming the initial skepticism. The state governor authorized a special marshal's expedition on February 20th. Due to weather conditions, it took this group, led by U.S. Marshal James Reynolds, 2 days to reach the vicinity of Colwood. According to Reynolds's official report, filed March 2, 1895, they approached the town before dawn on February 23rd. "What we encountered defies easy explanation," Reynolds wrote. Armed men patrolled the perimeter of the town. The main street was deserted, despite it being early morning when miners would typically be heading to work. The church bell tower had been converted to a watchtower with an armed guard visible. Reynolds's party consisted of 12 deputy marshals and 6 state police officers. They divided into 4 groups to approach the town from different directions, using the pre-dawn darkness and heavy forest cover for concealment. The operation was conducted with military precision. Reynolds himself had served as a Union officer during the Civil War, and his experience in tactical planning proved invaluable. The marshals strategically entered from multiple directions, overwhelming the unprepared deputies. Many surrendered immediately. According to Reynolds, they encountered Blackwood in the sheriff's office, calmly sitting at his desk as if expecting them. He offered no resistance, but reportedly said only, "You're too late. It's already done." This cryptic statement would later take on greater significance when investigators discovered that Blackwood had, the previous day, signed transfer documents giving the Eastern Coal Consortium legal ownership of the mine and much of the town's property. These documents were found in a sealed envelope addressed to a law firm in Philadelphia, ready to be sent once the road reopened. The scene inside Colwood haunted the marshals who documented it. People emerged from homes with a vacant, fearful expression that one deputy marshal described as the look of those who had forgotten what freedom meant. The improvised prisons held 97 people in conditions that Reynolds described as unsuitable for livestock, let alone human beings. The prisoners' physical condition was alarming. Dr. Theodore Manning, who accompanied the marshal's party, documented cases of frostbite, untreated respiratory infections, and severe malnutrition. In his medical report, filed as an appendix to Reynolds' official account, Manning wrote, "Many exhibit signs of what appears to be scurvy, indicating prolonged nutritional deficiency despite the town having adequate food stores." This suggests deliberate withholding of essential nourishment from detainees. The mine's office basement, the quiet room mentioned in Hayes's journal, contained 6 individuals in solitary confinement, including the town's minister. According to medical reports, these individuals were severely malnourished and showed signs of psychological trauma that the examining physician noted would likely remain with them permanently. Reverend Walsh, when brought out into the daylight, reportedly shielded his eyes and asked, "Have I been approved for release, Sheriff?" When told that Blackwood had been arrested and that he was now free, Walsh appeared unable to comprehend the information, repeatedly asking when his next loyalty assessment would be scheduled. The children who had been separated from their parents presented particular concern. Manning noted that many exhibited symptoms consistent with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress. The younger children flinch at sudden movements and speak only in whispers, he wrote. The older ones, particularly those who served as junior deputies, display a disturbing combination of authority-seeking behavior and extreme anxiety. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery in Blackwood's office. Meticulous records of every resident with notes on their compliance, usefulness, and dispensability. A map of the town had been marked with red and black ink, designating properties for what he termed retention or clearing. Later investigation would reveal that Blackwood had been preparing to transfer ownership of the entire mine and much of the town to the Eastern Coal Consortium once the winter ended. Among Blackwood's papers was a detailed timetable for what he called the transition. Once the snow cleared and the roads reopened, certain uncooperative elements were to be permanently removed, while cooperative residents would be retained as labor under the new ownership structure. Lists identified 47 residents slated for what was euphemistically termed relocation, primarily those who had resisted most strongly or held legal deeds to properties desired by the consortium. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by jurisdictional questions and the powerful interests involved. Blackwood was initially charged with multiple counts of false imprisonment, abuse of authority, and several deaths that had occurred during the lockdown, 3 elderly residents who had died from exposure when they were kept in unheated cells, and 1 man who had been shot while attempting to leave town. However, as noted in a frustrated letter from prosecutor William Harrington to the governor, dated May 18, 1895, the case became entangled in politics. Certain influential parties in Philadelphia have engaged a team of expensive lawyers, he wrote. They are working diligently to characterize the entire incident as a legitimate quarantine action that, while perhaps overzealous, was within the sheriff's authority during the winter isolation. The Eastern Coal Consortium deployed considerable resources to distance itself from Blackwood's actions. Their representatives claimed that any correspondence with the sheriff had been misinterpreted and that they had merely been exploring legitimate business opportunities in the region. The company's connections to several state legislators complicated efforts to pursue a broader conspiracy case. The trial, which began in Charleston on June 10, 1895, attracted national attention. Newspapers from as far as New York and Chicago sent correspondence. The New York Herald's front page on June 11th bore the headline, "Town Imprisoned, Sheriff's Reign of Terror in West Virginia Mining Community." Testimony from Colwood residents filled 6 volumes of court transcripts. Many still appeared fearful, looking over their shoulders even in the safety of the courtroom. Sarah Jenkins, who had operated the town's small hotel, testified, "The sheriff told us it was for our protection, that outsiders were coming to take what was ours. By the time we realized the only person taking anything was him, it was too late to speak out." Jenkins's testimony also revealed the insidious way Blackwood had manipulated the town's existing fears. "He reminded us of the violence during the mine strikes in Pennsylvania," she said, referring to the notorious Homestead Strike of 1892, which had left several dead. "He said the same forces were coming for us, and only he could protect us from outside agitators. Some believed him, at least at first. Thomas Wiley's testimony proved particularly compelling. The young telegraph operator described his gradual realization of what was happening and his efforts to contact the outside world. When asked by the prosecutor why he had taken such risks, Wiley replied simply, "Because I remembered what freedom felt like. I feared that soon none of us would remember any more." The defense attempted to portray Blackwood as a man acting under orders from higher authorities, protecting the town from unspecified threats. They produced letters, later proven to be backdated, suggesting that cases of typhoid had been reported in neighboring communities, justifying the quarantine. Dr. Hayes' testimony and the journal he had kept proved crucial to dismantling this defense. His detailed accounts of the systematic imprisonment and psychological control exerted over the town presented evidence that could not be explained away as health measures. Particularly damning was Hayes' documentation of Blackwood's own statements during a private medical consultation in late January. According to the journal, Blackwood had told Hayes, "Doctor, you're an educated man. Surely you understand that some must suffer for progress to occur. In 5 years' time, the Eastern Company will have modernized this entire region, and no one will remember or care about the discomforts of one winter." On July 7, 1895, after 4 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 7 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Harrison Moore sentenced Blackwood to life imprisonment at the state penitentiary. However, the wider conspiracy was never fully prosecuted. The Eastern Coal Consortium representatives were charged only with minor counts of business fraud, resulting in fines that amounted to a fraction of the company's annual profits. In his sentencing statement, Judge Moore addressed Blackwood directly. "You have committed an offense against not merely the people of Coalwood, but against the very foundations of civil society. You used your position of authority not to protect, but to imprison, not to serve, but to subjugate. This court sentences you not merely for the physical suffering you caused, but for the profound betrayal of the public trust placed in your office." While the town physically recovered, with buildings repaired and the mine reopened under new management, the psychological damage lingered for generations. Many residents chose to leave, abandoning homes and businesses for a fresh start elsewhere. Those who stayed rarely spoke of the winter of 1894-95. Property records from the county assessor's office show that within 6 months of the trial's conclusion, more than 60% of Coalwood's properties had changed ownership. Many residents sold at significantly below market value, seemingly eager to leave regardless of financial loss. By 1897, the population had decreased to fewer than 150 from the original 216. A follow-up report by a state mental health commission in 1897 noted that residents of Coalwood exhibited unusual psychological traits: excessive compliance with authority, reluctance to gather in groups, and heightened vigilance that the examining physician likened to the constant alertness of prey animals in the presence of predators. Dr. Charles Pemberton, who led the commission, wrote in his conclusion, "What we observe in Coalwood is not merely the aftermath of a traumatic event, but the destruction of a social fabric. Trust between neighbors, the foundation of any community, has been so thoroughly undermined that I fear it may never be fully restored. The residents speak of before and after in a way that suggests they view these as entirely separate lives. The town itself gradually diminished in prominence. By 1920, the population had decreased to fewer than 100 residents. The mine closed in 1931 during the Great Depression and never reopened. Today, Coalwood exists only as foundations visible among encroaching forest and as a footnote in county records. Scattered newspaper reports from the early 1900s occasionally mentioned Coalwood, typically in the context of its unusual social dynamics. A 1906 article in the Charleston Gazette noted that the town held no public celebrations, conducted no town meetings, and that residents generally avoided gatherings of more than a few people. The school remained perpetually understaffed, with parents reportedly reluctant to entrust their children to any authority figure. As for Sheriff Blackwood, Prison records indicate that he served 17 years of his life sentence before dying of pneumonia in 1912. He reportedly never expressed remorse, maintaining until the end that he had acted within his authority. A notation from the prison chaplain dated 1 week before Blackwood's death records his final statement on the matter. "A town is like a body. Sometimes amputation is necessary to save the patient. I was merely the surgeon." In his personal effects, collected after his death and eventually transferred to the state archives, was a small leather notebook containing what appeared to be plans for similar operations in other mining communities. These notes included detailed observations about the social structures of several towns, with annotations on potential leverage points and influential targets in each location. This discovery would later support historians' conclusions that Colwood was intended as merely the first of several planned corporate takeovers, disguised as law enforcement actions. The most troubling postscript to this case emerged in 1963, when historian Margaret Whitman uncovered additional correspondence between Blackwood and the Eastern Coal Consortium while researching a book on Appalachian mining communities. These letters, which had been stored in a misplaced file in the state archives, revealed a broader plan that extended beyond Colwood. Similar acquisitions had been planned for 3 other remote mining communities, with local law enforcement officials approached with comparable offers. Only Blackwood had successfully implemented the strategy. The other communities had either rejected the overtures or experienced early intervention that prevented the scenario from unfolding. Whitman's discovery prompted renewed interest in the case among legal scholars. A 1964 article in the Harvard Law Review examined the Colwood incident as a case study in the potential for abuse of emergency powers in isolated communities. The article, titled "Emergency Powers and Civil Liberties: The Colwood Paradigm," argued that the case illustrated dangerous gaps in oversight that could potentially still exist in remote areas. Whitman's research, published in her 1965 book, Authority and Isolation: The Colwood Incident, posed uncomfortable questions about how easily civil liberties could be suspended in isolated communities when economic interests aligned with corrupted authority. Her work prompted a brief renewed interest in the case, including a special feature in the Atlantic Monthly titled "The Town That Was Jailed." In this article, journalist Robert Carville tracked down several survivors of the Colwood incident, then in their 80s and scattered across the country. Their testimonies revealed the long-term impact of those 3 months of imprisonment. Martha Simmons, who had been 14 during the lockdown, told Carville, "I've lived in Chicago for 60 years, but I still can't hear a policeman's footsteps without feeling my heart race. I still check that my doors are locked 3 times each night. Some fears never leave you," another survivor. Henry Dobson, who had worked as a clerk in the company store, described how the experience had permanently altered his worldview. "I've never joined any club or organization since then, never voted, never put myself in a position where I have to trust anyone with authority over me." Once you've seen how quickly people can turn on each other, you don't forget it. Perhaps the most poignant record from this disturbing chapter in American history comes from an anonymous letter found among Dr. Hayes' possessions after his death in 1922, believed to be from a former Colwood resident who had relocated to Ohio. It reads simply, "I still lock my doors when I hear footsteps on the porch. I still lower my voice when discussing anything important. I still wake at the sound of boots on wooden floors. Colwood never left us, Doctor. We carry its silence wherever we go." The letter continues with an observation that would be echoed by psychologists studying the case decades later. "The worst part wasn't what they did to us. It was what they made us do to each other. I reported my neighbor for speaking against the sheriff. I did it because my children were hungry and informants received extra rations. How do you forgive yourself for something like that? I've lived in freedom for 27 years now, but I'm still imprisoned by what I became that winter, Thomas Wiley, the telegraph operator whose actions ultimately saved the town, perhaps best articulated the broader significance of what had occurred." In a 1930 interview with a Charleston newspaper, conducted for a retrospective on the 35th anniversary of the incident. The then 54-year-old Wiley reflected, "What happened in Colwood could happen anywhere given the right conditions. Isolation, fear, a figure of authority willing to exploit both. The only thing that prevents such abuses is constant vigilance and a commitment to questioning authority, even when, especially when, it claims to be protecting you." The case of Colwood represents a uniquely American horror, not of supernatural forces or inexplicable events, but of how quickly the structures of civilization can be corrupted when isolation, authority, and economic interests converge. It serves as a disturbing reminder of how fragile our systems of justice and community can be when tested under the right conditions. The records of Sheriff Blackwood's 3-month reign remain preserved in the West Virginia State Archives, though they are rarely requested. The final notation in the official file added by an archivist in 1968 notes simply, "Case closed. Materials retained for historical significance." But for those few families who can trace their lineage back to the residents of Colwood, the case will never truly be closed. As Thomas Wiley, the telegraph operator who ultimately saved the town, wrote in his memoir published privately in 1930, "There are two kinds of prisons, the one with bars that holds the body, and the one without bars that holds the mind." Sheriff Blackwood understood that the second kind was far more powerful than the first. Some of us never escaped it, even after the marshals came. In a particularly revealing passage, Wiley described returning to Colwood in 1910, 15 years after the incident. The physical town was there, the buildings, the mine, the church, but the community was gone. People walked with their eyes down, conversations stopped when strangers approached, and doors were locked, even at midday. What Blackwood destroyed wasn't just 3 months of freedom, but the very capacity for trust that makes a collection of houses into a community. Today, if you travel to the coordinates where Colwood once stood, you'll find only overgrown foundations and the partially collapsed entrance to the mine. No historical marker commemorates what happened there. The town, like the full truth of what occurred during those winter months, has been slowly erased by time and deliberate forgetting. Yet in county courthouse basements and state archives, in fading newspaper clippings and private family letters, the story remains, a whispered warning about how quickly justice can be perverted and freedom lost when no one is watching. And perhaps most disturbing of all is how few people today have ever heard of Colwood, West Virginia, and the winter when a sheriff imprisoned an entire town. The events at Colwood would later be studied by social psychologists as an example of what has been termed micro-authoritarianism, the emergence of totalitarian control within a. Philip Zimbardo, whose Stanford prison experiment in 1971 would explore related dynamics, cited the Colwood incident in his early research papers as a real-world precedent that demonstrated how quickly social norms could collapse under authoritarian pressure. "What makes the Colwood case particularly valuable to researchers," Zimbardo wrote in a 1973 paper, "is how it demonstrates that ordinary people, not trained soldiers or ideological extremists, can implement sophisticated systems of control and coercion when placed in positions of unaccountable authority." In 1967, the discovery of additional documents during a court archive reorganization project added new dimensions to the understanding of the case. A series of telegrams between representatives of the Eastern Coal Consortium and various state officials suggested that Blackwood's appointment as sheriff had been arranged, specifically to facilitate the planned takeover of the town and its valuable mine. One telegram, dated September 30th, 1894, just days before the death of the previous sheriff, from a Philadelphia lawyer representing the consortium to a state legislator, read, "Candidate identified, military background suitable, willing to implement necessary measures for property consolidation, requires official appointment and documentation." The reference to property consolidation was later interpreted by historians as a euphemism for the forced acquisition plan. The involvement of state officials in this conspiracy was never fully investigated, By the time these documents came to light in the 1960s, all parties involved had long since died, and there seemed little appetite for reopening old wounds. As historian Margaret Whitman noted in her subsequent research, the official narrative had already been established, a corrupt sheriff acting alone, punished for his crimes. The possibility that his actions were part of a wider corporate and governmental conspiracy remained unexplored in official channels. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Coalwood incident was how it demonstrated the vulnerability of isolated communities to exploitation and control. In his 1930 memoir, Thomas Wiley observed, "What protected larger towns and cities from such abuses was not better laws or more virtuous officials, but simply more witnesses, more connections to the outside world, more potential sources of resistance. Our isolation was our weakness." This observation has prompted some scholars to draw parallels between the Coalwood incident and modern concerns about surveillance and social control. In a 2006 essay in the Journal of American Studies, Professor Elaine Hartnett argued, the mechanisms Blackwood employed, surveillance, informants, control of information, exploitation of existing social tensions, remain the fundamental tools of authoritarian control, merely updated with technology. The Coalwood case reminds us that the vulnerability to such control often lies not in our laws, but in our social fabric. The fate of the individual deputies who had assisted Blackwood provides another disturbing footnote to the case. Court records show that while several were charged as accomplices, most received minimal sentences or probation after claiming they had acted under duress or fear for their own safety. Their reintegration into society proved problematic. Newspaper accounts from 1896-1900 document several cases of former deputies being ostracized or even attacked in communities where they attempted to resettle. One former deputy, James Anderson, gave a remarkable interview to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in 1905, a decade after the events. In it, he attempted to explain his own transformation from ordinary shopkeeper to willing enforcer. It happens so gradually you hardly notice it. First, you're just following orders because you're afraid. Then, you're given a little authority and find it feels good after being afraid. Then, you're the one making others afraid, and somehow you convince yourself it's necessary, it's for the greater good. By the end, I hardly recognized myself. This testimony aligns with what Hannah Arendt would later term the banality of evil in her analysis of totalitarianism, the idea that atrocities are often committed not by monsters but by ordinary people who incrementally accept and participate in immoral systems. The effects on those who had been children during the Coalwood incident proved particularly long-lasting. A study conducted by West Virginia University's Department of Psychology in 1945, examining the life outcomes of those who had been under 18 during the incident, found higher than average rates of alcohol abuse, difficulty maintaining employment, and problems forming stable relationships. The study's author, Dr. Carolyn Fletcher, concluded, the data suggests that early exposure to arbitrary authority and the breakdown of community trust created lasting patterns of insecurity and difficulty with attachment. One particularly haunting account comes from Edward Thompson, who had been 12 years old during the lockdown and had served as one of Blackwood's junior deputies. In a letter to Dr. Fletcher's study team, he wrote, I informed on my own father for saying the sheriff was no better than a thief. They took him away for 2 weeks. When he came back, he never looked me in the eye again, not until the day he died. I received extra bread and meat while he was gone. Sometimes I still wake up tasting it and feeling sick. The silence that surrounded Coalwood in subsequent decades was not merely a matter of fading memory. Several historians have noted what appears to be a deliberate effort to minimize documentation of the incident. State education records from 1900-1950 show no mention of the case in approved history textbooks, despite its significance as a legal precedent. Local newspapers that had initially covered the trial extensively rarely referenced it in subsequent anniversary articles about regional history. This institutional silence extended to legal scholarship as well. Despite the case establishing important precedents regarding the limits of emergency powers, it was rarely cited in legal textbooks or included in law school curricula until Whitman's research in the 1960s renewed interest. Legal historian Robert Jennings, in a 1970 review of the case's treatment, suggested the Colwood incident appears to have been subject to a form of selective amnesia in legal scholarship, perhaps because it raised uncomfortable questions about the vulnerability of our legal systems to corruption and exploitation. The physical erasure of Colwood itself followed a similar pattern. Unlike other abandoned mining towns in the region, which often became sites of historical preservation or tourism, Colwood was allowed to decay without commemoration. When the West Virginia Historical Society proposed placing a historical marker at the site in 1972, the motion failed to receive sufficient support from the state legislature's funding committee. As journalist Michael Collins noted in a 1975 feature for West Virginia Monthly, it's as if the state wishes to forget that such an abuse of power was ever possible within its borders. But in that forgetting lies the greatest danger, the risk that we fail to remain vigilant against similar abuses in the future. The Eastern Coal Consortium, which had been at the center of the conspiracy, underwent several mergers and name changes in the decades following the incident. By 1920, it had been absorbed into larger corporate entities, effectively obscuring its connection to the Colwood case. Corporate records from this period, examined by business historian Patricia Reynolds in 1980, show a systematic effort to distance the company from its involvement, including the destruction of numerous documents from the 1890s period during a supposed routine archival purge in 1905. Reynolds observed, "The corporate response to Colwood set a troubling precedent for how companies might manage reputational damage from ethical breaches, not through acknowledgement and reform, but through strategic corporate restructuring and document destruction." The legal aftermath of the case did result in some positive reforms. The West Virginia legislature passed what became known as the Sheriff's Accountability Act of 1896, which established clearer oversight mechanisms for law enforcement in isolated communities, including mandatory regular reporting to county judges and limitations on emergency powers. Similar legislation was subsequently adopted in several other states with significant rural populations. Yet, as legal scholar Timothy Westbrook noted in a 1998 review of these reforms, the laws address the specific mechanisms of abuse demonstrated in Colwood, but perhaps not the underlying vulnerabilities that made such abuse possible: economic desperation, corporate influence over governmental appointments, and the inherent power imbalances in company towns. Dr. Hayes, whose journal provided such crucial documentation of the incident, continued to serve as Colwood's physician until 1901, when he relocated to Charleston. His subsequent writings, including several articles in medical journals, often touched on the psychological trauma he had observed in the aftermath of the incident. In a 1907 paper published in the Medical Record, he proposed what may have been one of the earliest clinical descriptions of what would later be termed post-traumatic stress disorder, based on his observations of Colwood survivors. "There exists," he wrote, "a persistent condition following severe psychological trauma that manifests in hypervigilance, disturbed sleep, emotional detachment, and disproportionate responses to stimuli. I have observed this constellation of symptoms in numerous former residents of Colwood, persisting years after the actual danger has passed." Thomas Wiley, whose actions had ultimately broken the town's isolation and led to intervention, carried his own burden of survivor's guilt. In his memoir, he questioned whether he should have acted sooner. "I sometimes wonder about those who died or suffered while I gathered my courage. Could I have repaired that telegraph line in December rather than February? Every day of delay meant more suffering for my neighbors." This question has followed me through my life, a shadow that never fully recedes. Wiley eventually became an advocate for rural telecommunications, arguing that connectivity was not merely an economic issue, but one of civil rights and protection against abuse. His testimony before a Congressional Committee on Rural Development in 1918 directly referenced his experiences. A community without reliable communication with the wider world is vulnerable not merely to natural disasters, but to the disaster of unchecked authority. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Colwood lies not in its legal or historical significance, but in its demonstration of both the fragility and resilience of human communities under extreme pressure. The town's social fabric was shattered by Blackwood's systematic exploitation of existing tensions, yet individual acts of courage, from Hayes's secret documentation to Wiley's determined communication effort, ultimately prevented the complete success of the plan. The silence that surrounds Colwood, even today, seems to echo the enforced silences that characterized those 3 winter months of 1894-95. Yet in breaking that silence through historical research and documentation, we perhaps honor those who survived and those who did not. The story of Colwood reminds us that the horrors we most need to guard against are not supernatural or alien, but emerge from the darkest potentials within our own social structures and human nature, the capacity for ordinary people to both perpetrate and submit to extraordinary injustice when the conditions allow. As we contemplate the empty foundations where Colwood once stood, we might reflect on Thomas Wiley's final observation in his memoir. The true lesson of Colwood is not that monsters exist, but that they can be created from ordinary men given the right circumstances. The sheriff did not bring evil to our town. He merely revealed and cultivated what can exist in any community when fear overwhelms solidarity and when silence is rewarded while speech is punished.